Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining today's live program in which we turn a critical gaze on opposition leaders and their governments who ousted incumbents by promising to usher in a new era of democratic prosperity. Of course, we know that campaigning is very different from governing, and it's often very difficult for leaders for many reasons to implement the lofty pledges they make during their campaign rallies and speeches. But it's equally important to hold those leaders accountable to their rhetoric and to measure whether or not they've adequately lived up to both the hype and the trust placed in their hands by the voting public and citizens. That is the spirit of today's show. Recently, Malawi, Zambia, Senegal, as well as the Gambia in 2016, and Liberia last year provided a glimmer of hope across the continent when undemocratic leaders were defeated at the ballot box. In all those countries, the quality of democracy has eroded, with concerns ranging from human rights violations to attempts to remove the presidential term limits. The new governments have started positively with the reduction in repression and corruption and improvements for political rights and civil liberties. Yet many of these leaders have been accused of stalling on their reform agendas. In Malawi, for instance, President Chakwera has weathered a storm created by the appointment of family members to high-level government and diplomatic posts amid a series of economic crises. In Zambia, President Hichilema has been accused of undermining the rights of opposition parties while failing to deliver on an anti-corruption agenda. Senegal's President Faye has been in office for much less time, but he has been derided for clamping down on media freedoms while dissolving parliament in order to hold another round of elections this month. This show has convened leading activists and scholars to take stock of this development and much more while asking some very difficult questions. Does power corrupt, or is it the structural challenges, inherited debt of a zealous police and blind courts that create the conditions that too easily undermine even the best intentions of newly elected leaders? Jeff, how about you remind everyone about what we stand for here at the Resistance Bureau and introduce today's featured speakers?
Absolutely. And thanks very much, Mentade. To refresh everyone's memory, at the Resistance Bureau, our team works to spotlight the major threats to human rights and democracy while shining a light on both the personal and collective struggles for freedom, building networks of solidarity that unite us on the most important issues of our day. Among those we are pleased to have with us for today's discussion is Sadie Gassama, who gets a special shout out for joining us on very late notice. As many of you might know, he is a widely published writer and a longtime director of Amnesty Senegal, a premier human rights organization that is widely respected by authorities and the general public for its work on human rights and accountability issues across the region. We also have with us Laura Mitty, a return guest on the show and a sharp commentator on African affairs, who has used her platform and regular columns for independent newspapers in Zambia to demand accountable governance and to defend democracy. She has been at the forefront of efforts to push back against authoritarianism and to both expose and challenge corruption in the management of public resources. We're also delighted to be joined by Boniface Delani, a leading scholar and the director of surveys at Afrobarometer, a Pan-African research network that conducts public attitude surveys across Africa. From his home base in Malawi, Boniface leads the planning and management of all fieldwork activities for Afrobarometer. He's also a senior lecturer at the University of Malawi. Last but certainly not least, we are joined by today's discussant, Dr. Stephanie Burchard, who is a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses. She is an adjunct faculty member at George Washington University and the author of numerous academic articles, as well as a 2015 book that is germane to today's conversation, Electoral Violence in Sub-Saharan Africa, Causes and Consequences. After our main discussion, we will hand the mic over to our colleague, Dr. Nick Cheeseman, who will facilitate the Q&A portion of the show with Dr. Burchard. Of course, we also rely on you, our audience, to contribute to the discussion by posting your questions, your comments, and reflections on our platforms, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. We also hope that you send us your questions via WhatsApp, the number of which should be on your screen right now. With all of that said, Mentade, back over to you to start today's discussion.
Thank you so much, Jeff. So Laura, I'll come to you first because there seems to be growing concern about the performance of President Hakainde Hichilema and his United Party of National Development, including recent criticism of a ban on opposition rallies. This is just the kind of issue that Hichilema would have rallied against when he was leading the opposition. We also know that he faced major challenges when he took office, including our democratic institutions and problematic laws. Can you give us a balanced picture of his time in office so far?
Thank you very much. So yesterday I was at a meeting at which the question was, is the glass half empty or half full in Zambia? And it was across board very difficult to answer. Generally, the consensus was it depends who's talking and what it is you're talking about. So I think I'll start by saying that overall, if you look at the overall picture, maybe Zambia is at a better position than it was in August, or should I say July 2021. But that is only because we had gone so low. You know, the PAF is not a very good standard to compare yourself to. You see, because we had gone lower than we ever imagined we could as a country. And so you find, unfortunately, that this government and this president tends to compare itself to President Lugu and what the PF did. And the result, of course, is they can always prove that they are better. But that does not mean they are good or in any way reaching the standards that people expected of the party and of the era, as it were, this presidency. So in terms of governance, I'll say that I'll start with maybe what is positive. So what is positive is maybe being a private citizen. So as a private citizen, it's much better. There's no comparison between what was happening in PF and what's happening now, because while you still get sporadic activities of what we call cadres, ruling party youth harassing people here and there, it's nothing like the systemic oppression and tyranny that we suffered under PF. So I think as a private citizen, if you're talking about governance and everyday life, you get up here and go to the market and you do what you want, I think there's been a massive improvement. Where it's still probably the same, it's where if you are an actual critic of the government or in opposition. So civil society and I myself have found it very disappointing that this president has remained intolerant of criticism and making it very difficult for the opposition, for example, to operate. So it's a case of a different opposition leader being arrested on any given day, week, and that kind of thing. There was a period at which rallies were being prevented. We had a couple that were allowed when civil society made a lot of noise about it. So a couple were allowed. There is the abuse of the Public Order Act, which President Hichilema and his party really railed against when they were in opposition. So what is most concerning around all that is that the advancement civil society had hoped for, and I certainly had hoped for, was structural change. We had hoped that this government would make the kind of changes that would be sustainable and change the environment, not only for them, but to ensure that any other government coming after them would not take us backwards where PF did. Unfortunately, nothing has happened in terms of legal reform to the extent that maybe we would want. Of course, there's been the passing of the access to information law that was decades in and out of Parliament. That is a plus. But the Constitution, for example, is something that we really need to change. Unfortunately, I have to add that when the president spoke about the Constitution recently, he made an off-the-cuff remark, which was, I think, misconstrued, suggesting that he would like to maybe to delay elections. That's not what he meant at all. There's no way you can. But then the opposition jumped on it, and it became a case of people now saying you don't need a constitutional change. The president just wants a constitutional amendment because I would like to delay elections. But that's what happens when it takes you so long to do enough housekeeping. So the UPND has failed to do housekeeping in its first 2 or 3 years. The Constitution, Public Order Act, I would say cybersecurity law and that kind of thing. So structurally, we remain at the same position where the law can be abused. And then there's also the practice of it that I'm talking about. So if the opposition leaders, for example, find it very difficult to operate. What makes it, I think, probably even easier and should I say this government receives much less criticism than it should for the way it relates or treats the opposition is because I think most citizens are still unforgiving of most of the actors in opposition. So you find citizens, especially on social media, sometimes coming up with, yes, this is wrong, but they deserve it. If you see what I mean, which is a position which UPND was not in. There was a point at which, you see, if HH is arrested or something like that, there was just a sense that the PF is just being tyrannical. But there is no difference in the way that the UPND is using those laws, except that when it's done against someone like President Lungu, then everybody just says, well, he deserves it. Just before I came onto this discussion, I actually wrote I made a Facebook post making that point that, see, President Lungu, like right now, is complaining about his eligibility case. So, that the case is going back to court, whether he's eligible to stand in the 2026 election, and he's complaining that the courts are being abused and that kind of thing. So I was making the point that I agree that we shouldn't be going to revisit cases that were settled. And yet, when it is President Lungu saying it, something within you says, but you're complaining about the things you did. See, because he uses the very same example. So he says, for example, using proxies to go to court, and he used a proxy in this exact court, in this exact case himself. He's talking about you should bring prices back to where you found them. He took prices 3-4 times higher than he found them. He's talking about printing NRC secretly, which is something actually I've not heard about except from him. But what I'm saying is that, in a way, having the former president still out there is making life very difficult for activists, civil society, trying to say that what this government is doing, we should be worried about it. You see, because it's a case of not you, we will not listen to you. And maybe you do deserve a little bit more punishment than you actually got. So overall, I think in terms of the overall question, where you're talking about presidents that rule after coming on a massive wave of democratic promises and that kind of thing, I would say that in our case, there is a level of disappointment. I think, you see, some of the promises made were economic, for example. President Hichilema prides himself on being a great economist, and therefore he made a lot of promises, almost suggesting he would make Zambia a bit of heaven. And I think when he went into office, he discovered, you can promise a lot of things and desire a lot of things that you can't actually happen. But most people, I agree that given how this country has been buffeted by unprecedented crisis, so we've had the worst drought in probably living memory, which comes with load shedding, which then comes with other economic issues. Then there's the debt that is hanging over us. I think most people agree that this government has held fort economically. It's difficult to see how they could have done better economically. And it's also very clear that the absence of, how can I put it, let me put it this way. There is someone actually running the economy, but the sense of unhappiness in the country is huge because prices are high, and nobody's going to listen to issues of stories about the economy. So I would say that on the economic front, I'm not too unhappy. It's on the governance that is extremely worrying. And I think most of us will agree that it is governance. Governance is what underpins everything. You know, if because the government is failing to make structural changes, recently, I think most people heard again the suspension of the three judges who no one will argue misbehaved spectacularly in 2016. I mean, there's no question what they did in that petition was wrong. But the reason they are being suspended is because the person in power is the one against whom they ruled. It comes across as vengeful, and the timing as well, just before elections. So you get the sense again that the judiciary has been captured, or there's an attempt to capture the judiciary and create a bench that delivers the ruling that the sitting government wants. So yes, I think in terms of governance, I think I'd give this government 4 out of 10. And where we expected an 8 out of 10, for example. So I think that's where I ended.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that. I'm really glad you raised all these different issues, including the economy and how the Hichilema government has performed compared to its predecessor. Because I think you will see, and certainly I imagine when we hear from our colleague Boniface, a lot of the public opinion polling that is out there shows the economy, really being the
Is it me or?
I think we've lost Jeff for a second.
Sorry for a moment, that was me.
We'll give him 1 second, but perhaps if we don't get Jeff back, Mantari can jump in with the follow-up. Let's just give Jeff a couple of seconds. Okay, Mantari, do you want to keep going for now? We'll see if we can get Jeff back before the next section.
Sure. Thank you so much, Nick, and thank you so much, Laura. Like Jeff said, you've covered a lot of things. I think one of the main ways that President Hichilema and others like him will be evaluated on, as you've already kind of touched on, is the economy. And when he ascended to power 3 years ago with an economy that was suffering from years of deep corruption, crippling debt, and low economic growth, I think it's very consistent with what you said, that to some extent they have held the economy, they have held fort economically, and that whole reference to how it could not have been made better. So the question that I was going to ask you was very much related to kind of like the turnaround economically. And you have covered that. So maybe I'll just move over to Sadie. So for you, Sadie, one thing opposition leaders typically complain about across Africa, and rightfully so, is a lack of media freedom. So there are concerns in both Senegal and the Gambia, where space for independent media seems to be shrinking under the government led by former opposition leaders. In Banjul, for example, we have the recent detention of journalists Momodu, Dabor, and Musa Sharif. Are these mere growing pains, or is there something more dangerous going on here that we need to head off before it's too late? Sadie, that one is for you. Sadie, can you hear me? You are muted.
Yes.
Perfect.
I think if you consider the past, the previous regime in both countries, you can say that the situation is still, let's say, far better than what we've gone through. Because in the Senegal, as you know, in the last 3 years, from March 2021 to March 2024, in this country, tens of journalists were arrested, detained, simply for, expressing their views on the political situation of the country. Activists, hundreds of activists, according to the opposition, more than 1,000 activists have been jailed because of expressing their right to freedom of expression. And we have more than 65 people that have been killed in the demonstration. So We come really from the worst situation that the country has ever experienced. And even if the current government, because the laws are still here, all the laws that the previous government have used to silence and to repress freedoms and liberties are still in place. And the same prosecutors are still in place. And they tend to use the same law against the current opposition. And indeed, we have been calling, civil society organizations have been calling for the government to reform these laws. We have organized this country in June, what we call Assise de la Justice, which is a dialogue around justice and the laws of the country. The package of reform was proposed, most of them accepted by the government, to depenalize all offenses around the press, around freedom of expression, but still we are waiting this reform to be implemented. So as I'm talking to you, we have one opposition leader who is in the police custody, also two journalists currently, as I'm talking, are being interrogated by the police here in Dakar. So the situation is just really good, and we are very much worried that the same police practices, the same government practices will continue, and we need to keep mobilizing against these practices. In the Gambia, indeed, we cannot say that the situation is worse than the one that the country has experienced during the Jame area. During the Jame era, there was at all no independent judiciary. As you know, most of the judges at that time come from neighboring English-speaking countries, most of the time Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana. They are hired by the government and totally, I mean, controlled by the Jame regime. So they absolutely do everything he wants against the opposition, the press, and the civil society. So if you consider from the previous situation of the countries, the two countries experienced, we can say that the current situation is far better, but then we need to be very much vigilant as civil society and keep watching, warning, and confronting. Sometimes we need to confront. We don't need to collaborate because many people in this country will say civil society, we need to support the government, we need to help them extra. We need to help, but we need to advise, to give advice, but we need to confront also. When people are arrested, illegally arrested, when people are deprived of their rights to protest, then we need to confront the government. So this is the current situation in Senegal. Economically, the country is experiencing very tough times. Yesterday, not yesterday, but a week ago, the new prime minister, who in fact is in charge of the country, has made some very worrying declaration in the press, saying that the macroeconomic figures that the government, the previous government, has published, and that was used by the IMF and the World Bank to grant the countries, to give the countries grants, that his figures was not true. And now what we are expecting is that the financial markets and international donors will be very much worried, very much skeptical about the Senegal situation. So we are going to a very tough time, and maybe we expect the government to be tougher against the opposition during this time. And we are monitoring the situation definitely, and making sure that, I mean, we did not go back again in what we have experienced during the Macky Sall or during Abdullah era. In 17th of November, we'll be going to the parliamentary elections, very crucial elections, because all the opposition, including the PDS of the former President Abdullah and Macky Sall himself, have joined in a coalition to face the current government. Macky Sall, who used to be the previous head of state, is the head in the list of the opposition for this election. And the son of former President Ablaiwad is also in that list in the third position. So it will be a very tough competition the next election. And if the current government did not have the majority, then we'll be in trouble in the next 3 years, because the opposition will be in the position to, form a new government, which will be very much difficult in a system like the one we have in Senegal, which is a copy conform of the current situation, where the president have the power. Quite all the powers as far are with the president. So he can choose not to appoint a prime minister with the majority in the National Assembly and appoint whoever he wants. In that case, the budget and all the policies will be blocked by the opposition. So we are very much worried in what could happen after these elections if the current government does not have the majority in the parliament. The country will be in turmoil, both economically and politically, and with all the risks. As you know, Macky Sall before in the difficult period of January to March 2024 has threatened the opposition, threatened the country that if you don't follow me, if you don't, follow me in my will to postpone the election, then there are in this country all the organized forces that could take power. And it's all the organized forces is definitely the army. We had a very Republican army, but in case of the country is plunged in the trouble, as you know, in Africa, everything can happen. So we are very, very much concerned about these elections and the result and the outcome of the elections, if definitely the current government did not secure majority in the future parliament.
Thank you very much, Sadie. Can you all hear me now? Fantastic. All right. Never a dull moment on these live shows. And Sadie, thank you again for your contributions, especially coming on at such late notice. So big thanks to you. Boniface, I want to bring you in here because you've been waiting very patiently, and Malawi has been invoked several times, and the country has experienced some of the same disappointments we've been talking about this evening. President Chakwera, of course, won power by means of an opposition coalition after the results of the 2019 general elections were canceled by the courts. Yet he has seemed to really struggle while in office to deliver either political reforms or economic improvements. Some of the issues we actually heard Laura talking about, some of the challenges that President Hichilema has had there. So I wanted to get your sense of how do you assess the current situation in Malawi, and what do you think are the chances that President Chakwera actually wins re-election in next year's polls? Does he actually have a platform and a track record of success to run? I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, and indeed, listening to Rola, I can't help thinking how similar I think the Zambian situation is to the Malawi situation. Because as you rightly point out, I think Lazarus Chakwera won the elections in 2020 with 59% of the vote. Just to underscore, I think, the levels of disappointment with him, when the Afrobarometer did a survey in 2022 and asked Malawians who they would vote for if an election were held in 2022, only 26% said they would vote for Chakwera's party. And one can contrast that with the opposition, Peter Mutharika, who lost in 2020, and yet in 2022, maybe around 44% of Malawians said they would actually vote for him if an election were held, just 2 years into Chakwera's presidency. And I think the sense of disappointment in Chakwera, I think one can see that in a lot of the numbers that we see from survey data. Looking at the performance assessments of Chakwera, who came, I think, into office really with a lot of promise and a lot of excitement, and yet I think in 2022 his approval ratings were actually much worse than those of his predecessor. So while I think Peter Mutharika in 2019, just a year before he left office, 57% disapproved of Peter Mutharika's former President Peter Mutharika's performance. In two years later, 66%, 2 in 3 Malawians said they disapproved of Lazarus Chakwera's performance. Indeed, even if you look at Malawians' assessments of the overall direction of the country, again, I think under Chakwera, almost 88%, so almost 9 in 10 Malawians saying in 2022 that the country was headed in the wrong direction. Lower, much worse numbers than those, I think, that we saw prior to Chakwera's ascension to office. And then one also key issue in the Malawian context is corruption. There was a lot of hope in Chakwera that he would rein in corruption, and indeed his appointment of Martha Chizuma, who until that point was the ombudsman and had really quite an impressive resume from her prior work. And then she was appointed director of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, and with a lot of really public support. And yet, I think, during her watch as the Director General of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, there's been, one corruption scandal and after another. And even Martha Chizuma herself, at some point, was arrested by the police, I think, under the guise of, breaking the law here and there. So, and again, there's a huge public uproar, and also the donor community, stepped in, and I think the Chakwera government was forced to release Martha Chizuma. So when you look at all this, I think it just underscores the kind of disillusionment Malawians have in a government that a lot of people had high hopes of. Now you ask the question, Jeff, what are the chances of Chakwera's really winning re-election in 2025 when we have the next presidential elections? Well, looking at the public opinion survey numbers, things don't look good for him. He's still, I think, trailing his predecessor, who is intending to stand again in 2025. He's trailing badly against his predecessor, and I think it's likely that this election, the next year's election, I think this presidential election part, will go into a second round, and it remains to be seen whether Chakwera can still manage to cobble together an alliance and a coalition of those people who were disillusioned with the former president. But we are living in times where people feel that, well, as bad as things were, with the previous government, things are much worse now, and the economy is also in bad shape. I think we look at the availability of food. I think the drought that Lola talked about, that hit Zambia, also hit Malawi. And to be fair to Chakwera, I think he's also, his government, his presidency has come, I think, at a time when Malawi, initially he came into power, we're in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and then we've had several cyclones hitting the country and causing a lot of damage, and people losing lives as well as homes. And I think the drought that we are talking about has also hit the country. But these problems notwithstanding, I think for a government that came into power with so much promise, to see, I think, many Malawians, at least in the surveys, looking at going back to Peter Mutharika, speaks volumes about not the performance of Peter Mutharika, who was soundly rejected, but rather, I think, the failures of the Chakwera government really to deliver on what they had promised.
Thank you so much, Boniface. I'm interested to know how the data, looking at the countries like the Zambia, and Malawi, when you're looking at the changes in data that you've been able to track as Afrobarometer, have opposition leaders that have turned president in the way that they have performed, has that improved public perceptions? Do citizens in those countries feel that they're getting what they voted for? Looking at the public surveys that you have. And I think putting this in context, because I think one thing that Laura mentioned earlier was that the experience or the perception that ordinary private citizens hold of the Hichilema governance over the couple of years they've been in power versus the perceptions of critics of the government or members of the opposition are very different. So when you're looking at public perceptions in these countries, what does it look like?
Thanks, Matate. I think, generally speaking, we see a lot of disillusionment with the political, former political opposition leaders that get into power. In large part, I think this disillusionment is driven by the fact that the opposition, usually when they are outside government, they tend to promise way, way too much, so over-promising. So inevitably, they set themselves up to fail. And I think when they are judged against what they promise, most of them really are given failed marks. So this is, I think, a common problem that we see across the continent. Well, at least in the few countries where we've seen, I think, changes in government. But we should also remember, though, that what's actually more important, in my view, is less about how these new leaders perform, but also more importantly, the fact that voters themselves know that they have the power to vote out leaders that fail to deliver. So, these opposition leaders that get into power, once they are there and they fail to deliver, I think there is also a higher likelihood that they will be voted out, because the voters will remember that we voted you in and we voted out the previous government. So we have that power and that means to change leaders, and that the vote gives us that, that kind of power. So they actually, we're more likely to see a lot of alternations in the countries that have experienced a change of government. And I think that's a positive thing, because in the future, it will force really new governments to do their best to deliver. Otherwise, they'll have to face the consequences at the ballot box.
Thank you very much,
Just,
and everyone.
Could I just correct something?
Yeah, Nora, please go ahead.
Yeah. Yes, I say. So my point is not so much that that the public have a different perception, but I think I was talking more when it comes to the oppressive ways, what you're complaining about in terms of inability to speak up and that kind of thing, and everyday life. The experience, are saying, is better. The experience of life as a private citizen is much better, is incomparable to what it was before, because of the absence of cadres and that kind of thing. And also, you will find that when ordinary citizens are very vocal in Zambia, very loud, and I find maybe less fearful. But I think when it comes to the extent to which they are happy with the government, I would say that one of the greatest gifts that President Hichilema has is President Lungu. Just the fact that the idea of going back to Lungu, I think if there was someone as strong as HH was in opposition, HH would be in big trouble, because of the whole experience again of the economy. So when I say the economy is doing much better than it could have and the best it could, I'm speaking from an informed position. But if you speak to the person on the street, what they will say is the prices are higher, fuel, this, that, and this guy said he could do better. You see, so I just thought I would correct that.
Yeah, thank you for that, Laura. Really appreciate that, and everyone's contributions so far. Unlike opposition leaders, we here at the Resistance Bureau tend to under-promise, but I think we, and certainly our speakers, always over-deliver. So we're very distinct in that way. So thank you again, everyone. We're now moving on to the question and answer session that will be led by our colleague, of course, Nick Cheeseman, while also bringing in today's discussant, who has been very patient, Dr. Stephanie Bircher, to get her reflections on the conversation thus far. So Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Really interesting points. I don't want to hold us up too much because Stephanie's going to have more interesting things to say than me, but just wanted to flag one thing that I often think about in these moments, which is that it's quite easy for civil society groups to get quite attached to opposition parties one way or another, right? We often see a kind of infusion because, maybe both are being repressed by the ruling party. There's often common cause over things like electoral reform and so on. So one of the things you often see once an opposition party wins is a lot of civil society encouraged to come into government, right? Some anti-corruption campaigners might become the anti-corruption minister or the anti-corruption czar. You might have some figures from the media coming into the media watchdogs and and so on. And one of the things that that does is it makes the country quite vulnerable to civil society potentially being co-opted if the government goes wrong, because a lot of civil society isn't independent anymore. It's part of the government structure. And I think we don't often talk about it, but there's a little bit of a risk of academics and researchers doing that too, right? Because when you see an opposition that's being repressed, or you see a government that's authoritarian, you're often hoping for democratization, you're hoping for progress, you're hoping for less repression, you're often hoping for a leader that's, been very bad for a country to lose office. You can then be very invested in what comes next. And it's often quite difficult to sort of disassociate yourself from that and say, if I hadn't been part of that process, if I hadn't been watching this, what would I actually be saying about this government and what it's doing? And I think Laura put that very well, in the case of Zambia. It's tempting to say, well, it's Lungu. Look what he did in power. Why should we feel bad for him? Why should we be so concerned about democratic standards when it's applying to a leader who himself abused democratic standards? But actually, if we want to be consistent and if we want to strengthen institutions, we should be holding the new government to exactly the same standards as the old one and trying to enable Lungu to have the same rights to be able to stand in office as we tried to enable Hichilema to back in the day. So I think it's a really good discussion and really important for all of us to kind of try and keep that in mind. But don't want to stand in Stephanie's way any longer. So over to you, Stephanie. And then I do have some questions that have come in from the audience that I'll be throwing to the panel as well.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here, and I'm excited about this conversation. I have just a couple of things that I think sort of help to frame this. One, I will say, to piggyback off of what Nick was saying, that civil society is essential to holding governments accountable, whether they are newly installed opposition parties or your sort of standard, incumbent regimes. I'm thinking back to more than 10 years ago when Macky Sall came into power. I was talking to some folks from Myanmar who were very essential in ushering out WAD and bringing in the opposition candidate Macky Sall, who we are now discussing as the incumbent. And they were approached about joining in, participating in government in some fashion. And they all said, absolutely not. There's no way we are going to be a part of this. And I think to that end, Senegal, even though it continues to go through this every, 2 or 3 elections, that the robust and strong civil society is what continues to protect Senegal and continues to promote democracy. And even though we're still dealing with this, the fact that Senegal, Macky Sall could not take a 3rd term, that WAD could not take a 3rd term, is a good thing, is a very good thing. Big picture stuff, the fact that in many of these cases, and there are other countries in Africa where this holds true, when opposition parties come into power and take over a regime, when you've got weak rule of law and few guardrails, it is easy, it's not optimal, but it is easier to engage in some of these behaviors, these repressive behaviors. And it may be extremely sort of tactical, and it's what you have to do at the beginning to try and control. But even opposition politicians are politicians. They want to win office. And so they have to figure out how to win office. And if that means, continuing to accumulate power within the executive and putting friends in high places and, making sure anyone who wins office on day 1, you're happy. And then on day 2, you figure out how are you going to win the next election. And so when there is a weak rule of law and the ability to sort of manipulate institutions, lots of folks will do that, whether you are the best intended or, less honorable. The other thing I think that this highlights is the weakness of political parties and the need for stronger political parties. In many of these cases, if elections are a referendum on a single individual, an individual's regime, or democracy itself, it is really hard. It amps up, it takes things up a notch. Violence, which we haven't even talked about, election violence, but that becomes more likely when you've got an election that's existential. When the election is, if we don't win, democracy dies. If we don't win, this person is going to, corruption's going to go out of control. If we don't win, when the stakes are so high, it is a problem for violence, but also for then holding accountable the elected government in the post-election period. in a very ideal world, politicians are politicians, they're office seekers, they want to get office, and they do what they can within the limits of the law and what's allowable. And they put forward, manifestos, policies, platforms, and then individual smart voters get to decide what makes sense, what doesn't make sense, what do I agree with, what do I want to see out of my government. If all your elections are referendums on people and not policy, it is very difficult to hold folks accountable for policy decisions. I think that, and then the last thing I wanted to touch on really quick was some of the balance issues. So even when you've got an election that has some more substantive policy issues, and there's tons of substantive policy issues across these elections that need to be brought up, when you're talking about development, there's not often a policy con. It is, we're all pro-development. I was just looking through the main two parties in Ghana's manifestos today, and when they talk about development, they have different positions on, we want to focus on technology, we want to focus on industry and agriculture, but everybody wants more development. They want more education, they want more healthcare, they want more provision, and there's not a lot of differentiation. So if you don't have policy differentiation, how do you differentiate yourself? On individual characteristics, maybe that's ethnicity, religion, region, language, etc. And then that also, when you're voting as sort of a referendum on an individual or engaging in sort of just, rote voting that's not based on policy and, things that you want out of your government, it's hard for those elections to really produce, I think, accountable outcomes. And I will end it there and turn it over back to Nick.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really interesting insights. I'm excited to hear, how the panel responds. I should say, panel, we're not necessarily directing any of these points to specific people. So in a minute, we'll come back and, we'll ask anyone who would like to respond to what Stephanie was saying, what I said. We do have a couple of questions that have come in for specific people. So I'm going to get to those now, and then we'll come back to the panel. So Trevor from Zambia says, this is for you, Laura. President Hichilema has been turned out worse than Edgar Lungu. It's a vicious circle, and now feels that civil society is complicit. Do you share this perspective? I suppose the other thing we might ask Laura, and maybe everyone, is that if there's a sense that the new government hasn't performed better than the last one, is there a concern that people will disengage ahead of the next elections? If the choice in Zambia is between Lungu and Hichilema, and the choice in Malawi is between Chakwera and Mutharika, essentially people are being offered the choice between two governments that has disappointed them in the immediate history. Does that risk a lack of public engagement around the elections? We have a question to Sadie on Senegal. We are already tired of this government. Authoritarianism is rising and the situation is unhealthy. International journalists have moved on and are not telling us the story anymore. Does this assessment ring true for you? This is from a listener from Senegal. And what specific examples do you think might the commentator be referring to here in terms of journalists moving on and not necessarily covering the reality of what's happening in Senegal? Final, quick thought that I think it would be really interesting to hear people's perspectives on. One of the things that, of course, we also see is that the opposition, when they're in opposition, often are in charge or get power in other particular political arenas. So they might win local power, they might win, if this is the system of decentralization, they might take the position of mayor, they might be local councillors, local officials. I think it's a really interesting question about how much can we learn about what opposition parties are likely to do when they get elected from what they do when they're in power in these other kinds of subnational arenas? One of the things that I think is true, if we look at a lot of countries where, the opposition's been out of power for a long time, I would think of maybe someone like Zimbabwe, is that the opposition hasn't always covered itself in glory when it's been in power locally. And so it hasn't always used that opportunity to demonstrate that it could be a better form of government nationally by really performing and providing services locally. So it'd be interesting to hear a little bit from people about that point, about maybe local government and county level government being a stepping stone, and whether opposition parties always use that well and so on. So a number of questions there. Perhaps we'll come to the speakers in the order in which they spoke. So perhaps we'll come to Laura first. And Laura, Boni, Sadie, feel free to respond to any of those points in any order that you think interesting to you. So over to you, Laura.
Okay, so my question was directed pointedly, so I can answer it. No, I don't think this government is worse than the last, but I don't think, like I said, I don't think they're doing well. So I honestly think it'd be very difficult to be worse than the PF. I mean, they were out of this world. So if you look at even just in the sense of presence, with the UPND, you have something to engage with, you have something to argue with. So President Hichilema is a more of a present leader. His thoughts. He likes to talk. In fact, he loves to talk. Talk more than probably that he should. While President Lungu was not only, he was reticent. You had no idea what he thought about anything. But I think on a practical thing, I think when it comes to policies, I liked the point that Stephanie made that unfortunately, most of our changes of government are referendums on people and not referendums on policy. Although you could say that with PF, there was the issue, I think the issue of just the excess of violence and lawlessness was overarching. So I would say that what Zambians need to do is to ensure that they understand, we begin to hold this government to account on principle. And that's where we have a problem. We have a problem in that they know when they're doing wrong. They know they shouldn't be arresting opposition leaders and keeping them in cells for days on end. And it's very clear. You can't prove, but it's very clear that this eligibility case is there to try and prevent President Lungu from standing, and it's wrong. It's clear that this president is very sensitive and therefore does not really want the opposition to thrive, even if it is a weak and fractured opposition. When it comes to civil society, I think that the refrain that civil society is maybe weak and not doing its work always comes in Zambia. I always say that because the PF and UPND are different in the way they operate, civil society will necessarily be different in the way it acts. So under PF, civil society could not operate. So we spent maybe 40% of our energies trying to ensure you could hold a meeting, getting other actors out of jail and that kind of thing. And it was just extremely difficult. This government has been very smart in allowing civil society almost 100% space. It's also got a very open door policy. The ministers will come to meetings and speak your language and that kind of thing. So it's a different space. But civil society is the one that has made sure that it calls out all the things that have gone wrong. So, for example, it was civil society that called out the fact that opposition leaders were being arrested, but especially that the rallies were not being held. You've got to understand that in Zambia over the years, it's not only this time, it is civil society that you rely on for governance progress. All the time, we've always had either a hated opposition or a weak opposition. Even UPND was a very weak opposition, a very ineffectual opposition. And so I think that civil society, I still believe that civil society, when it's needed, always comes to the fore. But I suppose we don't have built-in, we don't have the number of scandals we used to have. A scandal a day, a scandal a week. So it was built-in today, 42 the next day. It's a completely different environment. And so I think the public will need to understand that. But at any time when this government has gone wrong, I think the civil society has stood up and made itself heard. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Sadie, over to you. How does Senegal look in terms of responding to some of those questions and the broader points that Stephanie was raising? I think you're on mute.
I think it's not fair to say that the current government is worse than the previous one. The previous one has been the cauchemar, as you say in French, in the Senegalese history. But as you know, the same law are still in place. All the repressive laws that exist since the colonial time, because the current penal code of Senegal, 1968, was just copied from the French colonial penal code that was used to repress Africans during the colonial time. There have not been meaningful changes in the penal code in terms of freedom of expression, right to freedom of association, and freedom of demonstration. So, and the new laws that was adopted also in July 2021 on terrorism, very repressive law that was used also against the opposition parties are still in place. As long as these laws are in place, the government will tend to use them, the prosecutor will tend to use them against the citizens. The same system, the police that was put in place, because if you look at all the people who are now being interrogated in the police, are being interrogated by what we call cyber criminality, cyber criminality. This is a unit of the police that was put in place during the Macky Sall era. That is some kind of brigade. They go to the Facebook, to Twitter, to internet, and they monitor all these social networks and see what everybody is saying against the government. They go to the let's say the internet medias, and monitor, and everything you say that can be considered as a defamation or spreading false news, can be used against you. And this is a big problem. I think that one of the first things about unit need to be dismantled. You don't need it in Senegal, definitely. You need it in the dictatorship, not in Senegal. It needs to be dismantled. So definitely the situation is not what we would have expected from this government. But we cannot say that it is worse or it is comparable to what we have gone through the last 3 years. Definitely, we need to continue to mobilize. And I think that one of the chance of Senegal is having a strong and independent civil society. Most of us would have been in the government of Senegal because, I cannot say that we have been publicly contacted to join the government, but in many instances, civil society people have been contacted to occupy a prominent position in the government, but all of them have declined of doing that. And I think it is very much important for the civil society figures to continue to do their work in the civil society, because it's very much important for the democracy. So definitely, I think that we definitely judge the government after the next elections, because what they are saying is that we cannot reform the country because we don't have control over the parliament. The current majority is the one of Macky Sall. Most recently, there have been 2 laws submitted to the parliament to suppress one of the chambers of the parliament, and also to suppress what we call Conseil économique et social. These 2 draft law was rejected by the current parliament. So they say, look at, you cannot, change this country if you don't have majority to reform the country. So we need that majority. So we are expecting that the new election will give them the majority, and that they will keep the promise of reforming the country, reforming the laws, electoral laws in this country. In this country, even if you look at the electoral code, it's amazing, because there are so many, let's say, infractions. Also, not infraction, the correct word in English, but you can't be jailed for just 1 month and deprived of your civil and political rights. For at 1 month or at 3 days in prison, you are deprived of civil and political rights in this country. So this is not electoral code that is, I mean, that respects is the country's obligation under the Civilian Political Rights Convention of the United Nations. So we need to reform the country. That need very good will, but we need to continue to push. We have the chance as Amnesty to meet with the president just few weeks when he got elected, and he made very strong commitments to reform the country. Very strong commitment. Indeed, you have, I mean, all the political allies around, I mean, that are influencing him. But I think that he's still listening to the civil society. Since the morning, I've been, I mean, talking with cabinet ministers, telling them, look at, you should release all these people that are arrested. This is not what we have promised to the country. So we have this dialogue with them. This is very much important to have high-level dialogue. I mean, sometimes through, I mean, through the WhatsApp, you send a message and respond at the highest level, and you sometimes you can influence, I mean, high-level decision like that. So we need to continue to advise, I mean, to support them, to encourage them to reform the country, because it's only when this law have been suppressed that we can really enjoy the freedoms that are in the constitution, but that we cannot enjoy really because of the laws that have been in place in the country.
Thanks so much, Sadie. I think, one thing to say, I don't want to be overly pessimistic, but of course, one thing that we might expect moving forwards is that given the sorts of figures that Bonnie was telling us about from the Afrobarometer in terms of the popularity of some of the leaders now and the growing popularity of some of the new opposition parties, one of the things that's going to be challenging is that, of course, there's going to be incentives for these governments to manipulate politics and to manipulate the next elections, because none of them are going to be guaranteed victory at the next election based on popular opinion and their performance. And so I think one of the things that we also need to keep in mind is that at the minute, we're seeing extremely difficult economic conditions across Africa. We see high levels of debt. We see high levels of food price inflation and so on. Malawi, we see some of the highest food price inflation right now, which is also impacting on citizens and people's perceptions of the government. And if that continues, one of the things we would expect if past practice is repeated would be that we'll see further challenges to the quality of democracy. So I think it's something that maybe we just all need to keep, in the backs of our mind, that things may get more challenging as the next elections come. Senegal, of course, is a long way away from the next elections, but they're pretty close now if we go to Malawi. So over to you, Bonnie. Do you have any, concerns as we get closer to the next election? We've seen some, things happen. We see, for example, the person who was in charge of the Electoral Commission, the chair of the Electoral Commission at the last election in Malawi, is not going to be the chair of the Electoral Commission for this election. Are there any things that we should be worried about, or do you think that actually, the democracy and the democratic system is going to be safe through the next election? And is there anything else, from the Afrobarometer side or from your side in Malawi that you'd like to bring, in response to the questions that we've heard?
Thanks, Nick. Very quickly, I think the point that was made, I think earlier about civil society really finding itself in a fix, I think is as relevant for Malawi as it is for the other countries that we've been discussing. You see, I think in the Malawi case, I think civil society organizations played a very pivotal role in organizing protests and the demonstrations against the previous government, and especially the elections that were held in 2019. So when you look at the current, perceptions of failure of the current government, in many ways, I think that is also seen as a failure of civil society that it, to a large extent, I think, helped to usher in this government. And I mean, talking to civil society organizations in the country, there's those that say, look, the current government really does give us an audience, and we can meet the president, whenever we request to do so, much like I think what we're hearing from Sadie in Senegal, but that the president really doesn't even act on what he tells us in those meetings. So civil society then finds itself asking the question whether they should continue to engage with a president who's welcoming, but then doesn't really do much in terms of follow-up action, or just disengage and then, risk, I think, being, shut out from trying to influence, I think, government activities. Now, to come back to the question that you raised, Nick, about the possibility that the disillusionment and the dissatisfaction with the performance of these former opposition parties, whether that could lead to, voter disillusionment that could lead to low voter turnout at the next elections. Thankfully, I think we don't see that in our data. I think in the Malawi survey of 2022, only about 7% said they would not vote if an election are held then. I know that there's been a recent survey that was recently done, and I think the sense of dissatisfaction actually in itself can drive voter turnout to say, look, we voted for you, you have let us down. We're going to come out again and vote against you so that we can show you that we hold the power. So it might actually have that opposite and galvanizing effect in bringing people out to vote. Now, I think, on this issue, whether it could lead to disillusionment with the democracy itself, I don't know. I mean, certainly, we have not reached a stage where we see stronger support for authoritarian rule on the continent. Indeed, when you look at the numbers at the continental level, support for democracy remains very strong, even though a lot of citizens on the continent continue to tell us that they are dissatisfied with how democracy is performing, and indeed the quality of democracy. So I think that's the part that we need to worry about. If we start to see a decline in support for support for democracy, I think we will have to really get worried. But looking at 2025 in Malawi, well, I think that yes, those cases you've highlighted, the removal of the chairperson of the Electoral Commission, the Director General of the Anti-Corruption Bureau, this really point to some negative, negative signals that maybe there is something that the government might be planning, either to accumulate resources dubiously to finance the election, and maybe also to have individuals that they feel they can at least control. The good thing with the Malawian law is that the chairperson of the Electoral Commission by law has to be a judge of the High Court or the Supreme Court. So thus far, even though there's been this change, I don't think we've seen any signs that there has been an attempt to influence, I think, the decision of the Electoral Commission. But certainly, I think these signs of corruption and increasing corruption, and I think some kind of pre-election violence that we've seen, pockets of that here and there, are some part, I think, worrying signals. But I still think that we still have a very relatively strong and vibrant democracy, and that people will still prefer to solve their political problems politically and through the ballot.
Thanks, Bonnie. That's good to hear. So one thing just to say to people, as of course, myself and Bonnie are big fans of the Afrobarometer, is that you can download the data for free from www.afrobarometer.org. And it's great. You can get data on all different countries across Africa, the popularity of governments, perceptions of corruption, and so on. So there's a lot of great data there to play with. Stephanie, is there anything there you'd like to come back?
Nick, can I just plug in something there? Because we've actually started to upload the most recent round 10 data on that website, so people can go there, especially using our online data analysis, to actually access the most recent data from 2024.
Right. Yes, I was doing that just a couple of days ago. I love playing around with the new data when it comes out. Stephanie, is there anything you'd like to come back on any of those points before I pass it back to our wonderful team, Mantari and Jeff, to wrap us up and bring us home?
No, I don't think so. But the one thing, and maybe I'll take this with Bonnie offline, I've looked through Afrobarometer, I'm a longtime user, in Burkina Faso, what were the indicators like before, over like the past 10 years or so, for support for democracy and support for authoritarian rule? Because I know that Afrobarometer frequently measures the supply and demand for democracy, and so I'm curious just if you have been tracking Burkina, because when we say, oh, that's a signal, we're worried about it, has that been a signal that has popped in other countries that confirms that, yeah, we should definitely be worried about it? And the only reason I say this is, one, I think it's interesting, but two, I've done I was in Kenya several years ago talking to some folks about election violence and how it impacts their perceptions of democracy. And many people told me, we know what democracy looks like. This is not democracy. It doesn't affect my perception of democracy, it affects my perception of this government. So back to you. And thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Stephanie. Bonnie, feel free to come back and, a couple of sentences on that before we throw it back, because I think that question of how do we actually identify and understand trends and what are the things that predict something like a coup or something like a popular loss of faith in democracy is a really good question.
Thanks. And again, I'll be very brief. I think for Burkina and the same thing with Mali and to a lesser extent Niger, over the years, we've actually seen a progressive decline in support for democracy and, an increase in support and acceptance of military rule. So I think these have always been telltale signs for us. And I don't want to get into the arena of predictions, but there are also other countries where we've seen this kind of trend. They might still be democratic now, but I, for one, would not be surprised if there was a military coup and people went on the streets to celebrate that. And we see this mostly, I think, in the Francophone West African region, where support for democracy, for military rule has been increasing over time. And so acceptance of the military to step in when elected democratic leaders are seen to be failing. Of course, the assumption from many people is that if the military comes in, they can clean things up and then leave. But we know from experience that once they step in, they never want to leave. So I think this is really quite a big issue. And when you look at demand and supply of democracy, Burkina has been one of the few countries where the supply of democracy is actually seen to be higher than demand. So the demand is low and the supply is low. But then when you see people saying, oh, we don't want as much democracy, and then we have too much of it, then I think that's really quite a concerning signal.
Thanks, Barney. So we're getting lots of additional comments and questions coming in now, including Laura, somebody telling us, as we know, of course, that it's always good to hear Laura and her insightful comments. So thanks, everyone who's watching. It's great to know that you enjoyed the comments and the insight, as do we. So thank you very much from me to Stephanie as we discussed it. Thanks to the speakers. And I'm going to pass back to Mantadi and Jeff to bring this show to a close.
Yeah, thanks, Nick, and thanks, everyone. One other thing I was thinking about when discussing the data from Afrobarometers, there's a number of democracy indices that come out, and one recent one that I was just recently reviewing was from International IDEA, which some folks might be familiar with. They publish an annual global state of democracy report, and among the countries worldwide that had the largest improvements on their scale of democracy this year, according to their metrics, of course, were interestingly Zambia, a country we talked a lot about today, and Liberia, both countries, of course, which recently had a changeover in government with opposition leaders winning at the polls. And then likewise, I think back, several years to Malawi, where they had the largest improvement in the world, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, and year after year, in every single survey from Freedom House and others, the Gambia typically has had the biggest improvements and made huge strides over the past couple of years. Of course, this might speak to what Laura was talking about the major dip that these new regimes were dealing with, and there was a lot of improvements to be made and some easy ones. So that might perhaps explain some of the big improvements. But I found that particularly interesting and just wanted to point that out because I think it was something that I was reflecting on hearing all of you speak today. But with all of that said, thanks again to everyone for joining us today. We would have loved, of course, to keep this conversation going, and we will on our social media platforms. But for right now, we have to bring it to a close, and we will definitely keep a keen eye on all of the countries and issues we've covered today, and we'll certainly highlight the important contributions that our featured speakers continue to make. I just want to say that all of you do incredibly important work, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here today to help us inform our audience and to engage on these important matters. And of course, a big thanks, as always, to our audience for contributing to the conversation today. Please stay in touch between our shows by visiting our website and also by subscribing on our homepage to get timely updates as well as show summaries, really cool participant videos that Montade is putting together, and other extras. On our website, you can also revisit all of our our past shows, as well as our recent Twitter spaces. All of these are saved under the episodes section, so you can go back and check those out. You can also find us on Twitter and Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. And as a final note, the continued impact of the Resistance Bureau is a real, true testament to the efforts of an entire team working behind the scenes. Thanks so much in particular to our tech manager, Peter Dory, who's with us here today, for keeping us on track, and our creative advisor, Ndondo Msaka, who creates all of the promotional images that you see on social media. Thank you again for joining us. We truly, truly appreciate it. Stay safe out there, and we will see you next time on the Resistance Bureau.